I came to fix her basement door. Just another job in a quiet town. But when she whispered, "I'm tired of being alone," the air turned heavy with something forbidden. What happened next would haunt me every night. I was 22, living in a cramped apartment on Cloverfield Lane, a forgotten corner of Fairview, Massachusetts, where the air always carried the faint tang of river water and rust from the old textile mill nearby. The town was small, the kind where everyone knew. The rusty kettle on Marwood Street poured the best coffee, and the streets went quiet after dusk, save for the hum of cicadas in summer. I made my living as a handyman, not out of passion but necessity, fixing leaks, patching walls, anything to keep the rent paid. My hands were rough, my toolbox heavier than my plans, and my days blended into a rhythm of small jobs for people who couldn't afford the big contractors. That morning, my phone buzzed with a call from a woman named Lila Hensley. Her voice was low, deliberate, like she was measuring each word before letting it go. She needed a flickering kitchen light fixed at her place on Sycamore Drive, a street lined with weathered Victorian houses that looked like they'd seen their prime decades ago. It was a simple job, she said, but it was driving her crazy. I pulled up in my battered Ford pickup, the one with a dented fender from a misjudged turn last winter, and parked outside her house. It was a faded blue two-story with a sagging wraparound porch, the kind that creaked under every step. The garden was a tangle of weeds, choking out what might have once been roses, and a rusty wind chime hung limply, clinking faintly in the August breeze. I grabbed my toolbox, the metal handle cool against my palm, and rang the doorbell. The chime echoed inside, deep and mournful, like it belonged in an empty cathedral. No answer. I rang again, shifting my weight, the heat already making my shirt cling to my back. The door creaked open, and there she was, Lila Hensley. She was taller than I'd imagined, with dark hair swept into a messy bun, loose strands framing her face like she hadn't bothered to tame them. Her eyes were a piercing green, sharp enough to make you feel seen in a way that wasn't entirely comfortable. She wore a white blouse, slightly wrinkled, and jeans that fit her like they'd been chosen with care, though the house around her felt like it was fraying at the edges. I guessed she was in her late 30s, maybe 40, not because of wrinkles or gray hairs, she had none, but because of the way she stood, straight but guarded, like she was holding herself together against something invisible. Her smile was small, polite, but it didn't reach her eyes. "You're Ethan?" she said, her voice softer now, but still with that careful edge, like she was testing the ground before stepping forward. "That's me," I said, lifting my toolbox slightly. "Here for the light?" She nodded and stepped aside, gesturing me in. The house smelled of lavender and old wood, a mix that hit me as soon as I crossed the threshold. The air was cooler inside, like she kept the windows open despite the heat, and the hallway was narrow, lined with black and white photos of empty landscapes, beaches, mountains, no faces. I followed her to the kitchen, my boots heavy on the hardwood floor. The space was small, with white cabinets that needed repainting and a wooden table pushed against one wall, a single chair tucked beneath it. Above, a bare bulb hung from a chipped fixture, flickering like it was on its last breath. "It's been like this for weeks," Lila said, pointing at the light. Her arms were crossed, her fingers brushing the edge of a silver watch on her wrist, its thin band catching the dim glow. "I tried a new bulb, but it's something else. Wiring, maybe." I set my toolbox on the counter, the clank of metal louder than I meant, and climbed onto a stool she'd left out, probably from her own attempts to fix it. The fixture was ancient, the kind with exposed wires that made my stomach twist. Half these old houses were fire hazards waiting to happen. I glanced at her, expecting her to head back to whatever she'd been doing, but she stayed, leaning against the doorway, her posture relaxed but her eyes fixed on me. It wasn't scrutiny, not exactly, but it made me hyper-aware of my movements, the way my hands worked the screwdriver, the way my shirt pulled tight across my shoulders. "Old wiring," I said, unscrewing the fixture's cover, the dust making me squint. "These houses are full of it, built in the 20s, right?" 1928, she said, her precision catching me off guard. "My grandfather built it, lived here until he died." I nodded, stripping a frayed wire with my pliers. "Bet it's got stories, then." She didn't answer right away, and I felt the weight of the silence, heavier than it should have been. When I glanced at her, she was staring at the floor, her lips pressed into a thin line, like she was holding something back. "More than I'd like," she said finally, so quiet I almost missed it over the hum of the wires. I didn't know how to respond, so I focused on the task, twisting the wires together and securing the connection. The silence stretched, not awkward, but charged, like the air was waiting for something to happen. I could feel her watching me, her gaze steady, not on my hands, but on me, like she was trying to figure out what I was made of. It made my skin prickle, not in a bad way, but in a way that made me notice things. The faint scent of her perfume, floral and understated, the way her watch gleamed when she shifted, the soft creak of the floor when she moved closer. I tightened the last screw and flipped the switch. The light flared steady, no flicker, casting a warm glow over the kitchen. "There we go," I said, stepping down, wiping my hands on my jeans. They were grimy, streaked with dust, and I suddenly felt out of place in her clean, quiet space. She tilted her head, studying the light like she didn't quite trust it to stay fixed. "You're quick," she said, her voice softer now, almost warm. "Thank you, Ethan." "No big deal," I said, shrugging, though her saying my name made my chest tighten for reasons I couldn't pin down. "Anything else need fixing while I'm here?" She hesitated, her fingers brushing her watch again, a nervous tick I was starting to notice. "Actually, yeah," she said after a moment. "The faucet in the upstairs bathroom. It drips. Keeps me up at night." "Lead the way," I said, grabbing my toolbox, the weight grounding me as I followed her up the narrow staircase. The steps groaned under my boots, and the second floor was dim, the curtains drawn against the afternoon sun, casting long shadows across the hardwood. The bathroom was small, almost claustrophobic, with a claw-foot tub and a sink that looked like it belonged in a black-and-white movie. The faucet dripped steadily, each plink against the porcelain loud in the quiet. I knelt to check the pipes, my toolbox open beside me, aware of Lila standing in the doorway, her silhouette framed by the hallway light. Her presence was like a low hum, not intrusive, but impossible to ignore. I didn't know why it felt different, why I was noticing the way her shadow stretched across the tiles or the faint catch in her breath when she shifted her weight. "Probably just a washer," I said, more to break the silence than anything else. "These old faucets are a pain." She didn't respond, and when I glanced up, she was looking at her watch again, her fingers lingering on the band, her expression distant. "There's still time," she said so softly I thought I'd misheard. "Time for what?" I asked, my hand pausing on the wrench, the words slipping out before I could stop them. Her eyes flicked to mine, sharp and unguarded for a split second, like I'd caught her off guard. Then she smiled, quick and guarded, like pulling a curtain shut. "Nothing," she said. "Just thinking out loud." I nodded, not pushing it, and went back to the faucet, replacing the worn washer with one from my kit. The drip stopped, and the silence that followed felt louder, heavier, like the room was holding its breath. I stood, testing the handle, and she stepped closer to check it herself, her arm brushing mine for just a moment. I froze, not because it was deliberate, but because it wasn't. The kind of accident that made you feel every inch of someone else's warmth, every shift in their breathing. My pulse kicked up, and I told myself it was nothing, just a job, just a moment. "Looks good," she said, stepping back quickly, like she'd felt it too. Her voice was steady, but her eyes didn't meet mine. "You're good at this." "Just practice," I said, my throat tight, packing up my tools to keep my hands busy. I didn't know why I felt unsteady, why her standing there made the air feel thinner. Back downstairs, she offered me a glass of water, and I took it, mostly because I didn't know how to leave. We stood in the kitchen, the steady light casting soft shadows across her face, and she asked about my work, my life, small things that felt bigger in the quiet of her house. I told her about Fairview, about fixing things for people who couldn't afford much, about dropping out of college because I couldn't find my place there. She listened, her eyes on mine, and I felt like she was seeing more than I was saying, like she could read the parts of me I didn't know how to put into words. "You're young to be doing this alone," she said, her voice gentle but probing. "What, 22? 22, I confirmed, feeling exposed, like she'd peeled back a layer I hadn't realized was there. "Young, but I manage." She nodded, her fingers tracing the rim of her glass, the motion slow and deliberate. "I was your age when I moved here," she said, her voice quieter now. "Feels like a different life." I wanted to ask what she meant, what had changed, what had brought that shadow to her eyes, but something in her tone stopped me. Instead, I finished my water, the glass cool against my palm, and set it on the counter. "I should head out," I said, though my feet didn't want to move. "Call if anything else breaks." She walked me to the door, her steps slow, like she was reluctant to let the moment end. "I will," she said, and then, as I stepped onto the porch, she added, "Ethan?" I turned, my hand on the railing, the wood rough under my fingers. Her eyes were on me, steady and unreadable, like she was holding something back. "Thanks for not rushing," she said. "Most people do." I didn't know what to say, so I just nodded, my throat tight, and headed to my truck. As I drove away, I caught her reflection in the rearview mirror, standing on the porch, her hand on her watch, her silhouette sharp against the fading light. This was only the beginning, but I didn't know how quickly things could spiral out of control. A few days later, I was back on Sycamore Drive, the streetlights casting long shadows across the cracked pavement. Lila had called that morning, her voice on the phone just as measured as before, but with a slight tremor I couldn't ignore. She needed a window fixed in her living room, one that had been stuck since spring, letting in drafts that made the curtains flutter like restless ghosts. It was the kind of job I'd done 100 times. Old houses in Fairview were always falling apart. But the thought of going back to her place made my pulse quicken, like I was stepping into something I couldn't quite name. I told myself it was just another job, that I was reading too much into the way she'd looked at me last time, but as I loaded my toolbox into my truck, the dented fender catching the midday sun, I knew I was lying to myself. I pulled up to her house, the faded blue exterior looking softer in the noon light, though the weeds in the garden still choked the flower beds, and the wind chime on the porch clinked faintly, out of tune with the breeze. I knocked, my knuckles loud against the heavy door, and she opened it almost instantly, like she'd been waiting just on the other side. Ethan, she said, her voice warm but laced with that same careful edge, like she was holding something back. She wore a navy dress today, simple but clinging to her frame in a way that made me notice the curve of her shoulders, the way her hair fell loose, curling slightly at the ends. Her eyes, that sharp green, carried a weight that made her seem older, closer to 40, I thought, not because of lines or gray, but because of the way she stood, like she'd seen too much to pretend otherwise. Her smile was small, almost hesitant, but it stirred something in me I didn't want to name. "Thanks for coming back," she said, stepping aside to let me in. The lavender scent of the house hit me again, stronger this time, mixed with the faint must of old wood. The hallway photos, those empty landscapes, seemed to watch me as I followed her to the living room, my boots thudding softly on the hardwood. The room was larger than the kitchen, with high ceilings and a fireplace that looked like it hadn't been lit in years, its mantel cluttered with a single candle and a small cracked vase. The window was a tall, double-hung beast, its frame warped and peeling, the glass streaked with years of rain. I set my toolbox down, the clank echoing in the quiet, and ran my hand along the wood, feeling the rough edges where time had taken its toll. "This one's been stuck a while," I said, glancing at her. "Probably needs sanding and a new sash cord." She nodded, standing a few feet away, her arms crossed loosely, her fingers brushing the edge of her silver watch again. "It's been like that since spring," she said, her voice soft, almost apologetic. "I keep meaning to fix it, but things pile up." I started working, prying the frame loose with a flathead, the wood groaning like it was reluctant to move. The silence settled around us, not uncomfortable, but heavy, like the air was holding its breath. She didn't leave, didn't busy herself with something else, just stood there, watching me with that same intensity I'd felt in the kitchen. I could hear her breathing, slow and steady, and it made me hyper-aware of my own movements, the scrape of sandpaper, the creak of the floor when I shifted my weight, the way my shirt stuck to my back in the heat. I kept my eyes on the window, but my mind was on her. Why she lived alone in this big, quiet house, why her voice carried that edge of sadness, why I couldn't stop noticing the way her dress caught the light, the way her fingers lingered on her watch like it was anchoring her. "You don't talk much when you work," she said after a while, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade, sharp but not unkind. I glanced over my shoulder, caught off guard, my hands pausing on the sandpaper. "Guess not," I said, trying to keep it light. "Helps me focus." She smiled, a real one this time, small but warm, her eyes crinkling at the corners. "It's nice," she said. "Most people can't stand the quiet." I didn't know what to say to that, so I just nodded and went back to sanding, the window starting to give, sliding up an inch or two with less fight. Her words hung in the air, though, and I wondered if she was talking about herself, about the quiet she lived in. The thought made my chest tighten, a mix of curiosity and something else I couldn't name. I finished sanding and started on the sash cord, my hands moving on autopilot while my mind wandered to the way she stood close enough that I could feel her presence like a current running through the room. When the window finally moved smoothly, I stepped back, wiping my hands on a rag, the dust clinging to my fingers. "Try it," I said, gesturing to the sash. She stepped forward, her arm brushing mine as she reached for the window, and I felt that same jolt from the bathroom, that accidental closeness that made the air feel electric. Her fingers gripped the frame, pulling it up, then down, her movements slow, like she was testing more than just the window. "Perfect," she said, turning to me, her eyes holding mine for a moment too long. My pulse kicked up, and I told myself it was nothing, just the heat, just the job, but I knew better. "Glad it's fixed," I said, my voice rougher than I meant, turning to pack my tools to keep my hands busy. "Anything else need attention?" She hesitated, her fingers grazing her watch again, and I saw it now. A reflex, a way to steady herself, like she was holding on to time itself. "There's a shelf in the study," she said after a moment, her voice quieter, like she was deciding something. "It's loose. I don't want it crashing down." I followed her down the hall, past more of those empty photos, to a small room that smelled of old paper and dust. The study was lined with bookshelves, floor to ceiling, crammed with books that looked like they'd been read 100 times. The shelf she pointed to was oak, heavy with hardcovers and leaning slightly like it was tired of standing upright. I knelt to check the brackets, my flashlight catching the glint of a faded title on a spine, something about ships, maybe, or the sea. Lila stood just behind me, close enough that I could hear her breathing, soft but uneven, like she was holding something back. "It's been loose forever," she said, her voice low, almost like she was talking to herself. "I keep meaning to clear it out, but some of those books were his." I paused, my hand on a bracket, the screwdriver cold against my palm. I didn't know who he was, but the way she said it, the way her voice caught, told me he wasn't here anymore. A husband, maybe, or someone close enough to leave a hole. I didn't ask, just nodded and started tightening the screws, the silence heavier now, like we were both carrying the weight of her words. The brackets were loose, the wood splintered where they'd pulled free, and I worked slowly, carefully, aware of her standing there, her shadow falling across my hands. She picked up a book from the shelf, a worn hardcover with a faded spine, and opened it, her fingers tracing the pages like they held something fragile. I glanced at her, saw the way her eyes softened, the way her shoulders slumped just slightly, like the book was pulling her somewhere else. I wanted to ask who he was, what happened, but the question felt too big, too raw. Instead, I finished securing the shelf, testing it with a push. It held firm, solid, like it could carry the weight of all those books and whatever memories they held. "Good as new," I said, standing, brushing the dust off my jeans. My voice sounded too loud in the quiet room. She closed the book, her fingers lingering on the cover, and looked at me, her expression softer now, almost vulnerable. "You're good at fixing things," she said, and then, quieter, "Not just things." My stomach twisted, her words hitting me like a current. I didn't know what she meant, not exactly, but the way she said it, the way her eyes held mine, made me feel like I was standing on the edge of something I couldn't see. I mumbled something about it being my job, my hands fumbling as I packed my tools, the screwdriver slipping in my grip. She walked me back to the living room, the light from the now working window falling across her face, catching the faint lines around her eyes, the curve of her jaw. She was beautiful, not in a way that shouted, but in a way that sank into you, quiet and deep. "Do you want coffee?" she asked suddenly as we reached the front door, her voice catching me off guard. "I mean, you've been here a while." I hesitated. I had another job across town, a leaky pipe at a duplex on Harrow Street, but the way she asked, the way she stood there, one hand on the door frame, her eyes searching mine, made me want to stay. "Sure," I said, surprising myself. "Coffee sounds good." We sat at the kitchen table, the same one from my first visit, with mismatched mugs and a pot of coffee that smelled stronger than anything at the Rusty Kettle. The light was softer now, the afternoon sun fading into a warm glow that made the room feel smaller, closer. She asked about my life again, where I grew up, why I stayed in Fairview, and I found myself talking, the words spilling out easier than they should have. I told her about my mom working night shifts at the hospital, about how college hadn't stuck because I couldn't find my place, about how fixing things was something I could do right. She listened, her eyes steady, her fingers wrapped around her mug, and I felt like she was seeing me, really seeing me, in a way no one else had. "You don't seem like someone who'd stay here forever," she said, her voice thoughtful, her eyes tracing my face. "You've got something else in you." I laughed, a little embarrassed, rubbing the back of my neck. "What, like ambition? Not sure I've got much of that." "No," she said, leaning forward slightly, her voice softer now. "Something quieter, like you're waiting for something to happen." Her words hit me harder than they should have, like she'd seen a part of me I didn't even know was there. I looked at her, really looked, and saw the tension in her shoulders, the way her fingers tightened on her mug, the way her eyes held a sadness she didn't name. I wanted to ask about her, about the books, about the he she'd mentioned, but the words stuck in my throat. Instead, I sipped my coffee, the bitterness sharp on my tongue, grounding me in the moment. We talked until the light outside turned golden, then purple, the conversation drifting from small talk to something deeper, though I couldn't pinpoint when it shifted. She told me about the house, how it had been her grandfather's, then her father's, and now hers, each generation leaving its mark in the creaking floors and chipped paint. She didn't mention anyone else, no husband, no kids, and I didn't ask, but the absence felt like its own presence, heavy and unspoken. The air between us grew thicker, charged with something I couldn't name, and I wondered if she felt it too. When I finally stood to leave, the sky was dark, the kitchen light casting long shadows across the table. She walked me to the door, her steps slower, like she was stalling. "Thanks for the coffee," I said, my hand on the doorknob, the metal cool against my palm. "Thanks for staying," she said, and her voice was soft, almost fragile. She reached out, her hand brushing mine as she handed me my jacket, and I froze, the contact lingering, her fingers warm against my skin. My heart thudded, and I knew she felt it too, the way her breath caught, the way her eyes flicked to mine and held. I drove home that night, the windows down, the cool air doing nothing to calm the knot in my chest. I didn't know what was happening, but I knew I'd be back. Everything is building to a moment no one saw coming. What she does next will leave a mark on me forever. It was almost 9 when my phone buzzed, the screen lighting up the dimness of my apartment on Cloverfield Lane. I was sprawled on the couch, a half E12, the kind where the streets were so quiet you could hear the hum of the gas station sign on Marwood Street a block away. Lila's number glowed on the screen, and my stomach did a strange lurch, like I'd missed a step going downstairs. Her voice, when I answered, was different, tight, frayed, like a wire about to snap. "Ethan," she said, and the way she said my name made me sit up straight. "I hate to bother you this late, but the basement door, it won't lock, it's stuck open, and I—" She trailed off, took a sharp breath. "Can you come over?" I didn't hesitate. I grabbed my toolbox, the metal handle cold against my palm, and was out the door in minutes, my boots scuffing the worn carpet of my apartment. The drive to Sycamore Drive was quick, the town asleep under a sky heavy with stars, the only light coming from the flickering neon of the rusty kettle and the occasional street lamp. Her house stood out, a single lamp glowing on the porch like a beacon, the faded blue exterior swallowed by the dark. The wind chime was silent, the air too still, and as I parked my truck, the dented fender glinting faintly, I felt a weight settle in my chest, like I was walking into something bigger than a broken lock. She opened the door before I could knock, her face pale under the porch light, her eyes wide and tired. She wore a loose sweater, gray and soft, hanging off one shoulder, and jeans that looked like they'd been thrown on in a hurry. Her hair was messier than before, strands falling across her face, and I could see now, in the harsh light, that she was closer to 40, maybe a little past it, not because of wrinkles, but because of the way her eyes carried something heavy, a quiet grief that made her seem older than her years. "Thank you," she said, her voice low, almost shaking. "I know it's late." "Don't worry about it," I said, stepping inside, the lavender scent of the house hitting me like a memory. "Show me the door." She led me through the kitchen, past the table where we'd sat drinking coffee, to a narrow staircase tucked in the corner. The steps creaked under my boots, each one louder than the last, and the basement air was cool, damp, smelling of earth and something metallic like old pipes. The door was heavy oak, its lock rusted and misaligned, refusing to catch. I crouched, my flashlight beam cutting through the dark, revealing a concrete floor littered with boxes, an old armchair with a torn cushion, a bicycle leaning against the wall with a flat tire. The space felt like a vault, holding pieces of a life I didn't know. "Looks like the latch is bent," I said, running my fingers over the metal, the cold biting into my skin. "I can fix it, but it'll take a minute." She stood at the top of the stairs, her arms wrapped around herself, her silhouette sharp against the kitchen light. "Take your time," she said, her voice softer now, but there was an edge to it, like she was holding herself together with effort. I worked in silence, the scrape of my tools loud in the cramped space, the flashlight beam bouncing off the walls. The lock was stubborn, the latch warped from years of neglect, and I had to pry it loose, my hands steady but my mind racing. I kept thinking about her standing there, the way her voice had cracked on the phone, the way she'd said my name like it was a lifeline. I wondered what had happened, what had left her alone in this big house, calling me at night for a door that wouldn't lock. The thought made my chest ache, a mix of curiosity and something deeper, something I didn't want to name. When the lock finally clicked into place, I tested it, the sound sharp and satisfying. "Should hold now," I said, standing, brushing the dust off my knees. I looked up, expecting relief, but her face was still tense, her eyes fixed on the shadows behind me, like she was seeing something I couldn't. "Lila," I said, stepping closer, my voice softer than I meant. "You okay?" She blinked, like waking from a dream, and forced a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Yeah," she said, her voice thin. "Just tired, long day." I didn't believe her, not with the way her hands gripped her sleeves, the way her shoulders were hunched, like she was bracing for something. I followed her back upstairs, the kitchen light harsh after the basement's gloom, and she offered me water, her movements automatic, like she was trying to keep things normal. I took the glass, the coolness grounding me, and we stood there, leaning against opposite counters, the silence thick enough to choke on. "You don't have to keep coming out here," she said suddenly, her voice low, her eyes on the floor. "I'm sure you've got better things to do than fix my house at all hours." I shrugged, my throat tight. "I don't mind," I said, and I meant it, though I wasn't sure why. "Keeps me busy." She looked at me then, her green eyes sharp, searching, like she was trying to see through me. You're too young to be spending your nights like this, she said, her voice soft but firm, like she was stating a fact. What are you, 22? 22, I confirmed, feeling exposed again, like she'd peeled back another layer. Not that young. Her lips twitched, not quite a smile, and she stepped closer, close enough that I could smell her perfume, that faint floral scent that clung to her like a memory. Young enough, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, that you shouldn't be here, not like this. My breath caught and the air in the kitchen shifted, heavy with something unspoken. I knew what she meant, felt it in the way her eyes held mine, the way her fingers tightened on her watch, the way the space between us felt like it was shrinking. I should have left then, grabbed my toolbox and walked out, but my feet were rooted to the floor, my heart pounding so loud I was sure she could hear it. Lila, I said, my voice rough, barely audible. What are we doing? She didn't answer right away, just stood there, her hand hovering near mine on the counter, so close I could feel the warmth of her skin. I don't know, she said finally, her voice breaking, like the words cost her something. I don't know, Ethan. I should have stepped back, should have said goodnight, but instead I turned my hand, my fingers brushing hers, and it was like a dam breaking. Her breath hitched, and for a moment we just stood there, the world narrowing to the point where our hands met, her skin soft and warm, her pulse quick under my thumb. I could see everything, the lines around her eyes, the faint scar above her eyebrow, the way her lips parted like she wanted to say something but couldn't find the words. I shouldn't have called you, she said, her voice trembling, but she didn't pull her hand away. It's not right. Then why did you? I asked, the words raw, spilling out before I could stop them. Her eyes met mine, wide and unguarded, and I saw it. The loneliness, the pain, the weight of a life I didn't understand but could feel. Because I'm tired of being alone, she said so quietly I almost missed it. And you make it feel like I'm not. My chest ached, her words cutting deeper than they should have. I took a step closer, the space between us disappearing, and her hand tightened on mine, her fingers trembling. I could feel her pulse, fast and unsteady, matching mine, and I knew we were standing on the edge of something we couldn't come back from. Lila, I said, my voice barely a whisper, tell me to go, and I'll go. She shook her head, just barely, her eyes locked on mine. I can't, she whispered. I don't want to. And then, before I could think, before I could stop myself, I leaned in, and she met me halfway. Her lips were soft, hesitant, then urgent, like she'd been holding back too long. My hands found her waist, hers slid to my shoulders, pulling me closer, and for a moment the world was gone. The kitchen, the house, Fairview, everything. It was just us, caught in something we both knew was wrong but couldn't stop. Her sweater was soft under my hands, her breath warm against my lips, and I felt her tremble, like she was fighting herself as much as I was. But then she pulled back, her breath ragged, her hands still on my shoulders, her eyes wide with something like fear. Ethan, she said, her voice breaking, we can't. I'm too old for you. This house, this life, it's not yours to carry. I shook my head, my hands still on her, not ready to let go. I don't care about that, I said, my voice louder, more desperate than I meant. I don't care about any of it. You will, she said, and her voice was like a door closing, firm and final. She stepped back, her hands falling away, and the space between us felt like a wound. You're 22, Ethan. You have a life to live. I've already lived mine. That's not true, I said, my voice cracking, stepping toward her, but she held up a hand, stopping me. "You're here, Lila. You're right here." She looked at her watch, her fingers shaking as they touched the band, and her voice was barely a whisper. "There's still time," she said, the words heavy, like a confession. "For you, Ethan, not for me." I wanted to argue, to tell her she was wrong, that whatever this was, it was worth it. But her eyes stopped me,